Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to CSP, to Jordi and Frank for inviting me to come here today. What we've been doing is, with my new hat on as the National Security and Foreign Affairs editor for Breitbart.com, always watch your six, is that we've been spending a lot of time in covering the events that are going on in Iraq and Syria, and especially in focusing on the social media aspects of what ISIS is doing. And what I've been asked to do today is to summarize the key developments and to talk about how they relate to the U.S. and national interest. Let me just say up front, the bottom line right now is that in the last 13 years, the nature of the threat has radically changed. And the U.S. response to the jihadi threat is either still mired in the 2003 threat assessment, so we're responding to something that's a decade old, or we're actually doing the exact opposite of what we should be doing, such as the decision by the president to finance fighters in Syria. So either we're out of date or we're taking the wrong action, or a combination of the two. Let me proceed by asking the question, what is ISIS? It is important not to call it ISIL. It is not about the Levant. It is very important to use its original name, which is Al-Sham. Al-Sham is important because it means more than Greater Syria, and it actually means more than the Levant. Al-Sham actually means the whole Greater Levant region and has apocalyptic connotations. If you read jihadi literature of the last 30 years, you will see again and again and again a theme by which the Sham region is the area that must be captured for the end times to begin and the caliphate to be reestablished. So this isn't just about Syria, it's not just about Iraq, it's not just about the Levant. It's about individuals who believe that they are in an apocalyptic age and that they are just about to reestablish the caliphate, and that's why their narrative is so very powerful. What can we say without doubt, based upon unclassified sources? They are the richest terrorist group in modern history. That is just a fact. If you compare them to other famous terrorist groups of the last 100 years, be it the IRA or ETA or Baader Meinhof, Rote Armee Fraktion, any of them, those people are little league, literally little league, after the capture of $450 million from the federal coffers in Mosul. This is an organization that has unbounded capabilities. Think of one metric. The official estimates for the 9/11 attacks, as published in the 9/11 Commission report, state that those synchronized attacks, with all the preparation, safe houses, training, and so forth, cost less than $500,000. So now we've got the capacity to do 800 9/11s. That's the factors we are talking about. Secondly, whilst Al-Qaeda, in certain areas, but very limited areas, functioned as a quasi-insurgency, it was, for the largest part of its post-9/11 history, not an insurgency, but a terrorist group. I don't want to get into the mechanics of this, but the big difference between a terrorist group and an insurgency is that an insurgency has a mass base of support, can mobilize large numbers of fighters, and the very simple metric is that an insurgency holds territory in daylight. Al-Qaeda was never very good at that. It was either co-opted with or cooperating with other true insurgent elements, such as the Taliban or the militias in Iraq, but this is different. ISIS, by its own capabilities, is functioning as an insurgency and is moving thousands of fighters in daylight and holding territory. So this is a qualitative change to Al-Qaeda, and a very serious qualitative change. Thirdly, we all know they are capturing our hardware. We left huge amounts of military material in Iraq, and now they are using it against the Iraqi government, against the Christians of the region, and against anybody who stands in their way. This is something Al-Qaeda has not had in the past. Oh, and please, a little footnote, it's not on the slide. Do not believe the mainstream media meme that these guys were too scary for even AQ. Wrong. That's absolutely rubbish. The split between ISIS and AQ had nothing to do with ferocity. It had to do with command and control. Al-Qaeda senior leadership wanted more control over al-Baghdadi, and he refused. And that's why the split occurred. The idea that AQ is somehow milquetoast, yeah, and they're not vicious, is absurd. So these are just as vicious as each other, but they've grown out of the original franchise and want to create their own brand. Fourth, and most important of all, and this is something that I don't understand how it's being missed, they're about to capture a country. Al-Qaeda never captured a country. Even when the Taliban ran Afghanistan, it was the Taliban that ran Afghanistan and AQ that married into, specifically through their family networks, into that government, but didn't actually control Afghanistan. ISIS is about to control Iraq. So that is a completely different qualitative threat. And then something that occurred in the last 48 hours, which from an operational point of view is highly significant. Al-Nusra in Syria, real bad guys, swore bayat to ISIS. So they've gone on record to swear loyalty to their new master, not Al-Qaeda, but ISIS. And theoretically, that could mean that all al-Nusra territory under the control, all the al-Nusra territory in Syria could automatically, by dint of that loyalty statement, come under ISIS control. Okay, so that's what we need to know about Al-Qaeda 2.0, if you will. Let me just take you through the work of my colleagues in the last 2 weeks at Breitbart. Francis Martel, Jordan Schachtel, and Mary Chastain have been 24/7 monitoring the social media usage by ISIS. And these are the kinds of threads that we've discovered. The most obvious one is the vicious, scary stuff. So the footage of them rounding prisoners up, Shiites specifically, and committing mass atrocities against them. We have the confirmation of satellite imagery today of mass killings, and also it should be going up in the next few minutes. We have footage of ISIS in Syria pushing their victims off a cliff. So they're performing executions and then pushing the bodies off a cliff. So you can have a look at that delightful footage as well momentarily at Breitbart. Then we have the reality on the ground. In northern Iraq, 50,000 Christians have fled in the last 72 hours. This is the Archbishop of Mosul, who is now stranded, left there by himself with 20 monks, and he is holding out between the fighters on either side of his location. So it pales by comparison to other Al-Qaeda atrocities in the level of viciousness and the lack of response adequate to protect the historic communities in the region. Here we have a wonderful picture in the last 24 hours of the capture of our equipment, the black flag of Al-Qaeda flying on one of our Humvees in an ISIS convoy. And just to show you how much they understand our social media, this is something we reported on about 3 days ago. It's called ISIL cats. So this is the soft side, so that you can see jihadis with kittens. Yeah. So they're very, they understand their info operations. Scare people that are the enemy, intimidate those who are fence sitters, and then spin up in the West stuff that won't horrify, but will be functioning on a frequency that we are already used to, which is the lovable kitten meme. But it gets even worse. Here we have a report of one of the 140 Kurdish children that were kidnapped. This is one of them that have been brainwashed by watching executions, beheadings under ISIS control, and then becoming a symbol of the organization that is fighting against their own families, against the Kurds. Here's the real so what of it all. As al-Baghdadi said when he was released from our prison, they're coming after us next. So this really isn't about Assad, it's not about Maliki, it's about the real targets that they care about. They have to establish a base of operations so that they can come and destroy our civilization next. So, let's get to the point. What does this all mean? Why should we care? What's the so what? ISIS is the new Al-Qaeda, but it is worse than Al-Qaeda. Why? Because it is about to capture a state, not just co-opt a government, but literally capture a state. It understands social media. Think about one thing. In the last 13 years, have you ever seen an Al-Qaeda post on Twitter or anything like it comparable to the ones I just showed you? With a child holding an AK, with kittens being held up by the jihadis. Think about that. Al-Qaeda didn't. These guys have spun it up in less than a matter of just a few weeks. And thirdly, its recruiting pool is absolutely enormous. We have reports from Southeast Asia of one country recognizing 500 fighters of their citizens are now with ISIS. We have the video of Australian and British jihadis beaming back in English to their audiences back home to come and join the fight. So literally, their recruiting pool is limitless. And most important of all, when it comes to US national interest, it's about the infidel. The Shiites are the 25-meter target. That's just the short-term target. We are the real ultimate objective, and we will be next. To understand this, I won't get onto my 8-hour lecture, but the only thing you need to do is read the people who shape the jihadi mind. Those are Azam, bin Laden's old boss, Abdullah Azam, the man who wrote the quintessential fatwa in 1979 in defense of Muslim lands, that made jihad a universal obligation of all Muslims. It's a quintessential text because Azam had a PhD in fiqh, in Islamic jurisprudence, from Al-Azhar University, the most important Sunni institution in the world. And he said, because we no longer have a caliph, we no longer have an imperial commander, you cannot wait for a declaration of jihad. The infidel is on the rise. You must become a jihadi, all of you. Fard Ain is the Arabic term. It is an individual and universal obligation. Of course, Kutub. Kutub for the brotherhood, understanding the older macro context. And Kutub is important. Why? Because his book, Milestones, has been captured all over theater, in the pockets of HVTs, high-value targets everywhere. And he said something quite explicit. More than 20 times in his book, he said, my fellow Muslims, you must understand that Islam is not a religion, not a religion. It is a political movement with a revolutionary goal to rid the world of jahiliyyah, of pagan ignorance of Allah. And the only way to rid the world of pagan ignorance of Allah is through jihad. Qutb was quite explicit. He's sitting in Egypt in the 1950s, and he says, there is no such thing as an Islamic state today, not even Egypt. None of them are Sharia compliant, and we must go on war to establish a caliphate that is Sharia compliant. And last of all, the one who is least known amongst the national security practitioners, I've only ever had one person in the IC and the intelligence community ever recognize this name, and that's Brigadier S.K. Malik. If you only read one book on trying to understand what's going on in Syria, in Libya, in Tunisia, in Iraq, in Egypt, in the whole region, it should be Brigadier S.K. Malik's book, The Quranic Concept of War. The Quranic Concept of War, which was endorsed by Zia al-Haq, the president of Pakistan, when it was written, states explicitly that the only center of gravity in warfare is the soul of the enemy. The only target that matters is the soul of the kufr, of the infidel. You must convert them or kill them. As a result of that being the target, the most efficacious mode of war, according to the general, is terror. So things like the Boston bombing, like 9/11, like Fort Hood, that is the best way to beat the infidel. And lastly, he said, all war has only one purpose: the realization of Allah's sovereignty on this planet. All war simply serves that purpose. So those are the stakes, and that's the strategic culture of the enemy. Last slide are the conclusions. What I would say if I were in a position of power today in the United States administration. Number one, we cannot work with Iran. This is ridiculous. I mean, it really is. It's a bad Monty Python sketch. The idea that a regime that's been trying to kill us for 40 years is somebody we can work with. You have to be smoking something that's not tobacco to believe that. Yeah? It's absurd. Quite. Second, we must not fund Syrian rebels. The idea that the intelligence agency that couldn't predict the collapse of Iraq can actually differentiate between moderate and extremist fighters in Syria. Excuse me? Is there not something wrong with that picture? We will be strengthening our enemies if Congress approves any of that funding to the Syrian fighters. It will go straight to Iraq and to destabilizing that regime. Third, we will need special forces. That's just a fact. We will need special forces. Aerial assets is one thing, but you have to control territory and you have to bring the Iraqi army back together. If you talk to the practitioners like I do, the people who've spent time in theater, the people from the communities, the special operators, they are the backbone. Without them, the Iraqis don't fight. When we're on the ground, they will fight. And that's something that is not understood, the dynamics of having our professionals in theater to keep the morale of the indigenous fighters where it should be. Egypt and Jordan are key players, UAE behind the scenes as well. And penultimately, from the domestic point of view, the US churches have to engage. The idea that 50,000 Christians have been purged from northern Iraq in a matter of just days, and the US churches are more interested in, as one large denomination did yesterday, saying that killing babies after a botched abortion is okay. Perhaps there are other priorities than whether or not you can kill babies that have been born alive after an abortion has been botched. What about the Christians that are alive and losing their lives in Iraq? And then lastly, and this is my bête noire, the most important of all, it would be nice in the 13th year of this war to start attacking the ideology. We don't. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface. And to quote Sun Tzu, warfare is not about destroying the units of the enemy. That's not the purpose of warfare. The purpose of warfare is to destroy the enemy's strategy. I think it's high time to begin. On that note, I strongly recommend this book that my wife's organization published, Fighting the Ideological War. We took the very best political warriors and ideological warriors from the Cold War, those that worked in Reagan's White House. We locked them in a room with the best experts on jihadi ideology today, and we asked them for a game plan. This is that book, Fighting the Ideological War. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Seb, very much. I apologize profusely for being late, more so because I really wanted to hear all of it, and I did show up, but the late Frank Gaffney once again. Seb, I trust you will be willing to take a few questions? Okay, good. Could I just ask you to clarify something, and maybe it was in the part that I missed, but when you say, and you may want to stay up there because we're going to continue to capture this, I think, if I'm not mistaken. They're about to take over a country.
Yeah.
Now, they've obviously got a lot of territory on one side of the former Syrian-Iraqi border. They've got a lot of territory on the other side. What I keep hearing is that they've probably run up against what is going to be an impenetrable Shiite barrier in the south simply because of the demography of the place. Is that what you have in mind? They're going to take Baghdad, they're going to take Basra and so on, or do you think that they will be looking to Jordan and elsewhere to create a new country, in effect, a new caliphate?
I think that the idea is that it will naturally fall into those divisions as they establish them based upon their own religious breakdown, but I think they will push on. They will push on. If they've managed to achieve so much in just a matter of 3 weeks, I think they will not stop there. And I think they will, as the balloon is squeezed, they'll move into other areas across the region. One thing I said before you arrived is that we need to call them ISIS because it's sham. It's not about Syria, and it's not about the greater Levant. It's about this apocalyptic region that is the beginning of the end times and the new caliphate. So they'll settle for whatever they can to begin with, and then expand as far as they can. It's a bit like, the analogy to Putin's a good one. How far is Putin going to push it? As far as we let him push it, right? So it's the same thing. It will be reactive to how we respond.
But just again, to be clear, when you say they're going to take over a country, do you mean they're going to take over the country we have known for several decades now as
Iraq?
Iraq? Or are they making up a new country and it will be that country that they will be holding?
Yeah, I think they will be taking over a rump of Iraq because, as we heard yesterday from Israel, Kurdistan is going to declare independence, and Israel is going to recognize them. So there will be parts of the original Iraq that they will not control for various reasons, but that won't stop them from trying to expand further into other areas. So it won't look like the classic Iraq, that's for sure.
Admiral?
Well, yeah, with this disintegration, it would seem to me now is the time to recognize a sovereign Kurdistan, to change some of the dynamics in the region with the Peshmerga, which is really holding ISIS at bay in the northern part now. And the second point I'd like to make, I recognize that voice of gloom, but let's face it, we've had a terrorist state for the last 34 plus years, and it's called Iran. And we've failed to face up to it every time.
Correct, Admiral, absolutely. But there's one big difference between Iran and these guys. Iran doesn't recruit Australians, Brits, Indonesians, Malaysians to come and become jihadis. They're their own threat, yeah? The IRGC, the Quds Force. These guys can recruit anybody from Minnesota to Baltimore and back, and once those people learn how to become jihadi fighters in region, when they come back home on a US passport, unlike the 1911 hijackers, that's a whole different level of threat that the IRGC could never compete with.
How about the sovereign Turkish state?
Kurdistan. Well, it's already de facto sovereign. It's functioned as a state for a decade. Whether we recognize it or not, I think we have to sit down with Ankara first, because Ankara will declare war if we're not careful about how we. Yeah, right, but think about it. He's in trouble. Erdogan's in trouble. When you're in trouble internally, what's it very easy to do? Point at an external enemy, right? So you don't want to push him into a corner. Yeah.
I think the Admiral just answered my question about the response of Turkey and their big concerns of looking at that. The other thing, I was at a session with Senator McCain and General Jack Keane last week. And one of the things that Keane made the point, and somebody said, well, how do you solve this whole thing in Iraq? And they said, well, you need to send Dave Petraeus and Ryan Crocker back over there to talk to them about. But the other thing he mentioned, the huge problem with all the money we poured into training, what Maliki now has done is just like what Stalin did to the senior officer leadership in the Soviet Union prior to World War II. We had extremely capable officers that we trained, but when we left, Maliki has just gone ahead and emasculated the whole leadership, and you've got a bunch of political hacks in there, and that's a problem. How do you solve that?
Right. I mean, we can talk off record. I've trained a lot of those guys, and when they got back home, they were basically retired, even before this happened.
Mario, and then we'll come to Claire.
Sebastian, I'm sorry. Thank you very much for a phenomenal presentation. I was very intrigued by what you said in the beginning and just now again, that they are that ISIS is very apocalyptic.
Correct.
we normally think of the Shia as being apocalyptic. If you could please elaborate about that.
Yeah, it's Sunni Islam has its own eschatology, quite a developed eschatology. The idea that Jesus is going to come back and kill all the Jews and Christians, all interesting stuff like that. Usually, it doesn't crop up, and we think of the Shia as having the occultation of the hidden imam. We associate apocalyptic scenarios with the Shia. That's not exactly correct. The extreme, more fundamental versions of Sunni Islam are absolutely just as apocalyptic as Shiism. We just don't concentrate on them and we don't read their texts. That's why it's so important to talk about this as being Sham, al-Sham. Al-Sham is absolutely a central theme to this end of times re-establishment of the caliphate, and it's absolutely part of Shia tradition. We just haven't paid attention to it.
Great. Claire?
Seb, I wanted to go back to the reference you made to the possible creation of a new jihad state, and I would say along the lines of what the Admiral said, if they succeed in doing this, it would actually be the third jihad state created, Saudi Arabia being the first, Iran being the second, and this could be possibly the third. But each one of those wants to be the leader of the international Islamic jihad movement and Islam more broadly. So where are the Iranians? Qasem Soleimani, Quds Force commander, is supposedly in Baghdad commanding the defense of the Nouri al-Maliki regime. Right. And ISIS continues on a romp. Not seeing a whole lot of Iranian response, and I'm wondering and maybe becoming a little bit concerned about which side the Iranians are really on.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting. The report started almost 10 days ago of 2,000 fighters being deployed by Tehran into Iraq. Very little information as to really did they arrive and what are they doing. So I can't comment on whose side they're really on. I'd add one qualifier though. For me, Iran is not a, Saudi Arabia is not a jihadi state because it's not a unitary state. It's the classic mistake we make in mirror imaging with Pakistan. We always say, why is Pakistan doing this? Because there is no such thing as Pakistan. You have to break it down. Are you talking about ISI? Are you talking about the civilian leadership? Are you talking about the judiciary? Saudi Arabia has always been schizophrenic. Yeah? It's always been, because of who Wahhab was, it's always had the fundamentalist streak, and out of the 6,000 princes that run the country, there's always been a large chunk that have always been jihadis. But that doesn't mean Saud doesn't understand the situation. Remember, what has Saudi Arabia done with Israel in the last 3 months? Got in bed with them. So at least some people in Saudi Arabia understand that caliphate may not be a good idea because the people who are most serious about it are going to kill you first, meaning House of Saud. So I'd be a little bit, I'd moderate that. I'm not excusing any... Yeah, you know, playing footsie under the table with the jihadists is more accurate for Saudi Arabia.
On that, Seb, could you just address a question? I understand that the Saudis have gone on high alert.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, in the last 24 hours. Yeah, in the last 24 hours, the Saudi armed forces have gone on high alert. I can't give you anything more than that.
But are they? Is it you're reading about that they're expecting ISIS to come in and try to grab their oil fields?
Could be. We know that they changed their attitude to various jihadi organizations very significantly in 2004 and 2005 because they started getting Saudi personnel killed. As long as they were killing infidels, that was one thing, but when they started coming, AQIP started coming into Saudi Arabia to kill Saudi security officials, they changed their tune very quickly. I think we're probably having a repeat of 2005 right now.
Yeah, it's over thus. Yeah, go ahead.
All diplomatic hurdles aside, is an independent state of Kurdistan the beacon of hope for law and order in this region that a lot of outsiders wish it to be?
No, because it can't export stability. Kurdistan is a very important factor because they're pretty moderate and they know how to fight. And they want to protect their own interests. So they can be leveraged as a US ally, but they can't save Iraq. The Kurds couldn't save Iraq.
As a follow-up, could it be a step
step to these tribalist regions that are forming and fracturing these post-World War I borders of these countries, could it be a step on the path to show them the way to establish your own sovereignty, as opposed to your own jihadi militia?
Look, let's be very pragmatic about it. And I'm not a neocon, I'm a paleocon, right? I just look at it from the point of view of US national security interests, and I put idealism aside for a moment. The fact is, the Kurds function because of their culture, their strategic culture. And let's not forget, everybody thinks Saladin was a great Muslim warrior. Saladin was Turkish, was Kurdish, right? Saladin, the greatest Muslim warrior after Muhammad, wasn't even an Arab. So they leveraged that history. They leveraged that warrior ethos in their own sense of interest. I don't think you can export the Kurdish model of stability into tribal areas any more than we were able to export American democracy into those areas. What we have to do is revisit 9/11 and remind ourselves, why did we deploy military force into South Asia and the Middle East after 9/11? For one explicit reason: to make it impossible for non-state actor threat groups to execute mass casualty terror attacks on the soil of the United States. Period. Period. So I don't care whose model you're importing or whether it's a strongman ally like Musharraf. The fact is, these territories must not be able to be used by threat groups of whatever name to execute mass casualty attacks against the United States or our allies, be it the King of Jordan or the Israeli state. I think that's the metric for all further action. Yeah.
What do you make of the Syrian Air Force attack into Iraq? Is that just a sideshow or what?
I think it's interesting. It's definitely not a sideshow, in my opinion. We've also had, Israeli Air Force make strikes in the last 72 hours on certain sites in the region. So, yeah, these things are important. These things are important. But, the bottom line is, this is irregular warfare. This is irregular, unconventional. As a result, airstrikes are nice, but they are very limited in their ability to change the ground truth. So it's not something to be sniffed at, but it's not a solution to the situation.
Seb, let me last question on that point. You mentioned at the end that we should be putting special forces in. To what end?
To make the Iraqis fight properly, because they're not.
So to continue the training exercise primarily, or to actually instruct in the fight or engage in the fight with them side by side?
The word advisor has a certain plasticity. So to take a broad interpretation of the word advisor, yeah? In Colombia, what did we do? They were advisors, correct? If you read between the lines, it wasn't exactly quite like that. So it needs to be a little bit more than this is how you hold an M4, if you know what I mean.
So in the event that there are Iranians in the mix, should we be fighting with them?
If it were up to me, Iran is an enemy of the United States and has been since 1979. I mean, I'm sorry, anybody who thinks Iran is not an enemy is deaf and blind.
No, I'm only asking the question, and we don't have time to dwell on it further, but I'm only asking the question because that seems to me to be a serious prospect here, is that we will find other advisors in the mix, and the excuse made by the administration that now we've got this budding military relationship with Iran, then that nuclear thing becomes less worrying, and terrorism and all the rest of it.
Look, strategy can only be done on the basis of logic and reason. Yeah, once you let fantasies about people wishing to cut your head off, potentially being able to be your friends, then strategy collapses. So, yeah, I would vote for logic and reason. All right.
Well, let's hope that it applies. Seb, thank you very much for giving us a short tutorial on it.